to him.
Go ahead.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
We are on the Doctrine of Sanctification, chapter 17 in Guthrie's book.
No, 17.
In fact, we have this chapter, and there are 2 chapters after this, and then we have finished Guthrie's book. So it's hard to believe, but
Here, Andy. This is 17. On the other page, maybe. You turn it, yeah.
and just think, we do this in actually 2 semesters with a whole lot of other books with it. So it's kind of nice to be able to go slow and to, just
Yeah.
kind of take your time with it. When you're in class, it's like, you're reading a chapter a night, and you're writing review papers on it, and it's actually kind of nice to be able to take your time and go through it. So last week, I don't know how far we got, but I know we at least began the C on being a Christian is about growing up. Justification has to do with becoming a Christian, sanctification with living out the Christian life. In justification, we receive God's grace by faith, and sanctification, by God's grace, we become active servants of God and neighbor. And so it's kind of like justification is the beginning, right? This is the beginning of this process. And then from justification, then you kind of moved out over to sanctification. And remember, Guthrie, just like Guthrie says, there's no justice without love, and there's no love without justice. Guthrie also couples justification and sanctification. You cannot study one without the other. They are connected, if you want to think of like as chain links. You cannot study one without the other. They belong together when you study theology.
Can I say something?
Of course.
With grace theology,
Yes.
we talk about prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. And just like we cannot talk about justifying without sanctifying, we cannot talk about justifying and sanctifying without prevenient grace, which is the grace that woos us to embrace justification. So prevenient grace is the company of God
Yes.
before we even realize that God wants us. It's already operating.
Thank you. And thank you for defining that, what that means, prevenient grace.
So, because we hear prevenient grace and people sometimes wonder, oh, is that a different kind of grace? No, it's the same grace at a different time of our lives.
It's like it's a process.
Yeah. And I think what's most beautiful about it is that it is in our lives before we even know.
Before we even know.
God.
Is that the same root as providence?
Prevenient?
Providence, I think, is
No, prevenient is to come before.
it comes
Prevenient.
before.
Fresh.
So
Okay.
it comes
Oh,
before.
Yeah. Prevenient.
Prevenient.
We
Okay.
Prevenient.
Okay,
It's before we
okay.
even know God.
Okay.
Yeah.
God is already loving us
Got it.
and wooing us into knowing God and then
Yeah.
embracing God.
I love it.
Got it.
I love it. And afterwards, you could look back
Yeah.
And see
you
it.
see prevenient grace.
and you see it. You see God's almost footsteps
Mhm.
within your life,
Yeah.
and how God was moving. And
When you were not even aware.
yeah, to me, it's almost like, the way I looked at it, it's almost like chess pieces. When you're playing someone in chess, and someone really good in chess, and they're setting up all of these moves, and you're playing like
Have
a
no idea.
sheep. And and there's Bobby Fischer getting ready to to stomp on you. When I look back in my life, throughout my life, I could see God's hand within my life, even though I didn't know God. And that's the way I look at it.
But he knew you.
But God knew me.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And God knew that I was going to become part of the fold, and God knew that I was going to do this with my life, even though I did not.
And I think you can even, this is what spiritual direction does actually. It helps you go back and see how God's love has accompanied you through your life. And so it kind of makes you aware of, oh, this is it. And almost sees when God said, okay, now it's time to call for your attention. And then,
Yeah.
Do you ever think, where would I be if it hadn't been for God
Yeah.
calling you.
Most definitely,
Uh-huh.
all the time. All the
One
time.
place I wouldn't be is here on Sunday morning.
None of us would be here.
None of us would be here.
today.
None of us
In
would,
bed.
We don't
Yeah.
even know each other. You know?
None of
You
us would
think
be
of it,
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think about that all the time,
So
Bob.
your eternal existence depends upon it.
Yes? Your eternal existence depends upon it, and your existence here depends upon it. I think about that all the time. I had all my plans of what I wanted to do, and all of a sudden things change. It kind of hits you like, the other day I was thinking about the church I was attending when it was a young woman I was dating in college, just started college, and when she took me to church, and I just remember the name of the minister who was preaching that day, and they didn't have a permanent ministry yet, and his last name was Ackerman, Reverend Ackerman, and it just came to me. And I just remember it not like a thunderbolt, but it was kind of like, it was like somewhere in me, just a light switch flipped on.
Was he a Presbyterian?
No,
Because we had a Jim Ackerman here in our presbytery not too long ago.
Mm-mm. No, and he was fairly along in years then. I mean, if he's still around today, fantastic for him, but I would be surprised. But he was just this neat minister, and he was just preaching on the gospel, and something just clicked. Something just clicked. And it just, like, once that switch flipped,
Do you remember what he was talking about? Was there something he
no,
said?
I remember it was a gospel account. It was a narrative about Jesus doing something.
Mhm.
And it just clicked. And once, I think in my life, once that switch flipped, there's no going back. There's no going back. And I can't remember, it's hard to remember what it was like before. Not that I can't, but it's hard to remember without that relationship, without that connection, and seeing the world through that lens. But looking back, like Alejandro was talking about, you can see it. You can see it. Even though we didn't go to church, I had a great aunt or grand aunt, I don't know what the correct term is, who almost was a nun, and she left before she took her final vows. But she was very spiritual, very, very active within the church. And, she would always talk to me about God and Jesus, and that even though, I didn't know what the relationship was, because we didn't go to church, I didn't go to Sunday school. But she was always this spiritual beacon within my life. She was always very important to me. And she used to babysit me when my mother was at work. And so she was always around me. So looking back, I see, well, she was very important in my early formulations about life. And even though I don't fully understand, it was almost like seeds were being planted, And so,
Should make a good sermon series
on what?
on your aunt. This is the.
And she was the neatest woman.
The thing that comes before.
She was the neatest woman.
Yeah.
She lived in Brooklyn, and she had my great-grandparents' home. It was just this 3-story building, and in the backyard, it's all cement, but my great-grandfather and his brothers built these big planter boxes out of concrete. And so you had a real thin, narrow walkway that went back to like a shed, and then 2 planter boxes. And they were always full of vegetables and fruits. She had a fig tree that all the men in the family would come over in the fall and prune it and cover it, wrap it like a baby.
In Brooklyn.
Yeah, in Brooklyn. They would cover the roots, they would wrap it in burlap, and then they would wrap it in like a tarp, and they would put like those 5-gallon, the joint compound buckets,
Yeah.
they'd put the bucket on top, and then wrap it in twine. And then in the spring, they would come by once a week. Someone would come by and poke a hole and look and see if the green was starting to, and they would do this methodically every fall, and then they would unravel it the tree was like 80 years old. And it lived in Brooklyn, and it produced figs this little tree had so many figs, and my aunt would just eat all you want. She could care less about how it would impact your stomach later. That was your problem. But if you were a kid, but she had a compost pile. I mean, she was so into like caring for things to me before it was very popular.
Mhm.
She wouldn't even kill, she would let ants out of her house. If she found an ant in her house, she would let it out the window. I mean, she was very neat. She was a neat woman. But she, to me, was my beacon as a kid. But I look back and I see that she's in my life. Not only as a family member, but as someone who exemplified to me what it was to be a Christian, even though I didn't know what it meant to be, even when I was a kid. You know,
Right.
so going back and you look at these things and you see, like chess pieces, how God puts things in your life,
And then checkmates you.
and then checkmate,
Got you.
and you're done.
Gotcha.
Checkmate.
Fish.
And then God says, you had enough fun when you were in college, and now you work for me. You put out, one of my guardian angels is burned out because of you. Now you work for me the rest of your life. So, yeah, it's most definitely. All right, there is a biblical image that helps us clarify this seemingly complicated situation. It summarizes not only everything we have been trying to say about the relation between justification and sanctification, but also everything we have tried to say about what it means to be a Christian. The image is that of a growing child. To be a Christian is to be growing up. It means to be moving toward maturity, the complete or whole humanity that is the full stature of Christ. Seen from this point of view, the question we have to ask ourselves is not how close to perfect are you, what degree of righteousness have you achieved. The question is, are you growing? Have you settled down comfortably within the growth you have behind you? Or are you willing to keep up the painful, constant struggle to keep on growing? Is your Christian life an attempt to simply hold on to what you think you have already achieved in your relation to God and other people, or are you willing to risk what you have already learned and accomplished to explore new and more complete ways of loving God and other people? Do you spend your life depending and protecting yourself as you are, or are you willing to subject yourself to the dangers of admitting that you are still immature in your beliefs and way of life and need to plow into new ways of thinking and living? To be a Christian is not to have arrived at some state or condition of Christian existence, but to be constantly having growing pains. It is not to be something, but to be becoming something. It is not to have arrived, but to be constantly on the way. That there is, wow, bagpipes. So there is this continual movement to become Christ-like. There's never a point where you can say, I'm done. Now, you hope that you get closer and closer to the line as you move, but it doesn't mean you will ever reach that point.
If the picture is that of growing from a child to an adult, is there such a thing as spiritual puberty?
Oh, yeah.
I would imagine
Oh,
so.
yeah.
I would imagine so.
Explain.
I would imagine so.
If you think of your life, you'll recognize your puberty.
Well,
Awkward
following
phase.
puberty,
Yeah,
a person is able to reproduce. So there comes a time in a Christian's life when he's able to reproduce other Christians. The fruit of the Spirit flowing through him brings other people to faith in Christ.
Yeah, yeah,
Hopefully you do it through your whole life. though.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. Hopefully you're doing that.
as you go.
I thought when you said puberty, you meant more rebellion.
Yeah, but when
Oh,
you're
yeah.
Oh, I thought more the
Yeah.
awkward phase.
Yeah, the
Yes.
awkward rebellion phase,
all,
you know.
all of
when-
the above, I think.
Yeah.
Depending on your personality.
But I think there is that awkward phase
Yeah.
because when that switch for me clicked on, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean that everything was downloaded into my brain and I know, okay, it was very awkward. Well, what does this mean
Spiritual
now?
acne.
Yeah. But like we were talking last week, I had no one to disciple me. I mean, so, I went out and got a Bible, and I remember reading and asking everyone I could bend the ear questions. Who's this? What's this? What does this mean? Who's this? What is this? Who is this person? And I drove people nuts. But I honestly wanted to know, and there was no internet back then. It wasn't like I could go ask Google, so I had to bend someone's ear, whether it be the minister or anyone I could grab hold of. And I just remember it was that young woman's mother. One day we were talking. She said, one day I'm going to come and ask you questions. And I said, no, I don't think that day will ever come. And then that day actually came.
Famous words.
Yeah, famous last words. But yes, I think there is that awkwardness. And I know you from what you were saying now, it's not what you were looking for it to mean, but I think it does. I mean, I think there is that awkwardness, especially at first. You just don't know what it means. What does it mean to be a Christian and to grow? And then it's, to talk about evangelism.
Well,
And yeah.
What Paul said in Hebrews, it says, by now you should have been teachers, but I can't feed you except
Right.
with milk.
And that chapter we worked on last week. Right. It's Paul saying, you guys should be doing this already. Why do I have to bring you back to milk? Yeah. To me, one of the wonderful things about the epistles is you look at these churches and, when you think, oh, the early ones had it right, and you say, okay, they struggle
And they had
like
Paul.
we struggle. And they had Paul, and they have the apostles, and they still struggled. And they still, I always go back to something one of my professors said. Paul writes to the Corinthians, and they said 500 years later, the Bishop of Rome is writing the Corinthian church about the same problems. So it's like, Paul wrote these people. 500 years later, the bishops are still writing the same congregation. Look, you're still not getting this.
Right.
500 years later. But I guess every church is the test.
Well, those early churches had opposition too.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that, led some astray.
Yeah, and we know that. I mean, when you think about Paul, or even the Gospel of John, when you read these works, and they're continually saying, "Be careful of those coming behind me," because that's exactly what was going on. Paul would go ahead and walk out the front door of the church and leave, and these people would come right in through the back door, and don't listen to him. He's all wrong. Don't listen to him. He's got these pieces are wrong in what he's teaching. So it's not only that Paul is trying to work with these churches, but he's also trying. It reminds me of in the old circus, it's the lion tamer with the chair and the whip. In one side he's trying to minister to this church, and the other side he's trying to keep out these heresies and these people who are trying to, whether it be Gnostics or whether it be Judaizers. Some people are semi-church, but not all. Some of them are not church at all. Some of them are just totally off base.
And some of it was just their old life that kept creeping
Yeah,
back
sure.
in.
It's the familiar. It's no different than the ancient Hebrews who left Egypt. Because we romanticize. And when things get tough, when they're out in the wilderness, and things get tough, they say, it really wasn't that bad in Egypt. At least we had other foods to eat other than this manna. So it's thinking about the good old days, and we do it. We all do it. We all romanticize, and when we romanticize, you never focus on what? The bad parts. And there's always bad parts. There's always bad, good, neutral, but you focus on remember when, you were young and you were 20 and you had no bills to pay, but you don't remember, but you're still living with mom and dad, and you have to wash dishes in the sink, but you don't focus on all these other things. You don't focus on, you live paycheck to paycheck. You don't focus on, I had to write papers every night. In undergraduate, you focus on, we went out every night.
Right.
But it wasn't just that. You have the grind of life is always there. is always there, but we romanticize. So whether you're thinking about people who say, well, you know, this Christianity stuff is nice, but it's kind of difficult. It was a little bit easier when we can just go down the block, light an incense, drop a coin in a coffer, right? Than it is following this living God. You know, so yeah, we romanticize. And so they did it then, and they did it in the desert. They did it in the wilderness. And, you know, and the sad thing is, my goodness, you know, it was like they were still damp from where they crossed the sea on dry ground. And they're already talking about going back, you know.
I wonder, is there a way to determine where a person is in their
Spiritual
transformation from child to adult in a Christian life?
Kierkegaard would say definitely no, anyway.
He's coming.
He's coming.
Church near you.
He's coming, yes, yes. You know, that's a great question, and maybe Alejandra can answer that, working with the spiritual direction. Are there ways to do that, to measure where someone is on their spiritual walk?
I think there are ways to know when you're starting to go really, really deep. I mean, I wouldn't label, I'd be careful with labeling somebody, you know, this is where you are.
Yeah.
But you do notice, as you watch the movements of the Spirit in people's lives, you can tell when somebody has come to a point of no return.
Yeah.
And I think you can tell when, even you yourself can tell when you're going deeper and you can. You know, it's, I think you feel that you have to be, I think that's part of discernment.
I was thinking from a pastor's point of view. Sunday morning, you're looking out at all these people in the congregation. How do you know where they are in their Christian life and what you need to feed them, you know, to bring them along?
Well, I think like Alejandra was saying, I think the only way to do that is to know people, is to know your congregation, is to get to know people. And isn't that what Jesus did? Right? Jesus never treated people as a number. You know, Jesus is not racking up souls. Jesus is knowing people, right, on a personal level.
You know, when I would visit, back when I was a pastor, I would ask people, tell me your story.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I want to know
Yes.
where you came from. You know, when did
Yes.
you come to know the Lord?
Yes. Yes. Yes, Bob. We as Christians, we should all be storytellers.
We have a story, and
We have a story. And it's that story, that's how people, in my opinion, it's not so much taking a Bible and beating them over the head with it. It's telling your story, and so people can see how Christ has interacted with your life. And these are the things, I believe, that draw people to Christ, or draws Christ closer to them. It's narratives, because this is how Jesus worked. Jesus didn't threaten people. Jesus got to know them and built relationships.
Well, he did threaten a few.
Well,
well,
The Pharisees.
he did,
they
but
thought they knew everything.
yeah, but
They didn't need him.
they kind of egged him on. All right, thank you. Yes, and most definitely, Bob. You know, Jesus was definitely not one to back down from a discussion, and he held those in power to a higher standard.
I often wondered when they led him to the brow of a hill and they were going to throw him over, but he passed through their midst.
Oh,
I
yeah,
just wondered what happened there.
yeah, yeah. All right,
Did
we'll
he
see
do
you next
some
week.
kind of